Hello, welcome back. Thank you so much for being here. Today we're going to be testing out the new Urban Decay Moondust Space Cowboy eyeshadow palette. So this is supposed to be available at Ulta on September 29th. If you're located in Canada, this is currently available on Shoppers Drug Mart, which is where I purchased mine. This will retail for $49 US or $65 Canadian. This is also made in the US of domestic and imported ingredients and has a 24-month shelf life. So this is what the inner palette looks like. So it's actually a really cute little star. Definitely awkward packaging if you're someone who doesn't like palettes that are in weird shapes. Definitely going to be a little bit awkward, but at the same time, this will be very cute to display. And this does just slide open like this. You do not get a mirror in here. It is just completely pink on the other side, and this is what the palette looks like. So we do get two mattes. We get Space Cowboy Rides Again, which is sort of what these other shades are centering around, and some other Moondust shades. The description on the box says, "Get starstruck with the new eyeshadow shade Space Cowboy Rides Again, inspired by fan favorite shade Space Cowboy, but with an extra dose of sparkle. The star isn't coming alone to the party. We're introducing complementary, harmonious shades to amplify Space Cowboy Rides Again. Mix and match the velvety mattes, metallics, and shimmers for zero party fouls." Okay, so this is a really cute little palette. Color story wise, definitely looking like a very neutral, very everyday palette. But let's take a quick look at the swatches. We have Vibing, VIP Only, A-List Energy, Space Cowboy Rides Again, Endless Party, and No Sleep Club. So as we can see, it's definitely a very sparkly palette. And Space Cowboy Rides Again, I did swatch beside the original Space Cowboy. And the original, I feel like, is a little bit warmer. I would say Space Cowboy Rides Again is a little bit more sparkly intense, but definitely less warm as well. I feel like we've got a little bit more peach to it and maybe a little bit of a silver glitter in there as well. I do really, really like the new one. And Space Cowboy is one that I really enjoy. I love throwing that shade all over my lid without anything else because it just gives such a beautiful, wet, glittery look to the lid. So I do really love that shade. And for that reason, I was excited to grab this palette. The Moondust shadows have become insanely popular over the last couple of years, and I feel like that's kind of their new thing. The naked palettes were their thing for the longest time, but I feel like they're really enjoying the love that the Moondust shadows are getting. Last year they did come out with a quad of 4 Moondust shades. This year they have a quad as well, but the shade Space Cowboy Rides Again and A-List Energy from this palette are also in that quad. You get 4 shades and it retails for $39 US. So on first blush, I do think that this is the better value. Now, since this is a very neutral palette, but I really want to look at these shimmers a little bit more, I'm thinking it would be most beneficial to do some eye swatches, and then I'll create a look to wear for the rest of the day before I show you comparisons and final thoughts. So let me zoom you in and we'll get to doing some eye swatches. All right, so my eyes have just barely forgiven me for the Danessa Myricks eye swatches, but here we go again. So to start, I think I might go into Vibing, and this is just that more cream shade in the palette. I'm getting quite a bit of kick up with that, but that doesn't necessarily bother me. For some reason, I felt like there would be a mirror in this palette. I was kind of surprised to see that there wasn't. I do just have some concealer down here as well. I am a little bit worried about the price point of this palette. $49 or 65 Canadian is a lot of money for 6 shades, and it is a limited edition palette. You don't get a mirror. The packaging is very, very pretty, but I do feel like a mirror is something that we do enjoy with our eyeshadow palettes. So that is the shade Vibing. This is one that I would, of course, use to either set my eye primer, or I would use to start my crease. Just a basic generic cream shade that's in a lot of these more neutral palettes. Next, I'm going to go in, I'm just going to use the same brush cleaned off, and I'm going to go into VIP only. This is the only other matte, so I felt like we would just get these sort of mattes out of the way. I really do like that matte shade though. Again, getting quite a bit of kick up from the mattes, but this shade in particular is really, really nice. This is definitely a shade that I would use in my crease, but again, I can see myself using this as the base for a lot of different looks with this palette. So that is the shade VIP only, and then over here is Vibing. So just two very standard, very easy mattes. Let's take these off and get into the first set of shimmers. For the next shade, let's go into A-List Energy. And this has kind of like a duochrome shift to it. It's kind of like a pinky gold. This is very, very pretty. And again, this is one of the shades that is in the quad they also released this year. I was going to review the quad until I saw this palette coming out, and then I realized it did not make sense to get both when two of these shades are already in that quad. Okay, so that is A-List Energy. Very, very pretty. Again, kind of like a pinky gold shift to it. Not the most duochrome, but still very pretty and definitely has a really lovely shift. On the other side, we'll go into Space Cowboy Rides Again. And that is the one that's just in the center, kind of the whole point of this palette. And like I mentioned, I love to wear Space Cowboy on the lid all on its own, so I am expecting to love this one as well. This one definitely is more intense than the original. Oh, it's so pretty though. Yeah, this definitely has a little bit more of a silver to it, like a silver kind of almost champagne leaning as opposed to the original. Definitely more sparkly than the original. I've loved Space Cowboy just because of how wet it looks, but this is really, really beautiful. Really, really beautiful. I do like that new shade. Okay, getting into these last two shades, I'm going to start with No Sleep Club, and I am going to take this one on a brush. This is kind of a sequin shade. It is a matte, but it does have shimmer particles in it. Again, very much like a typical sequin shade. We see a lot of those from ColourPop in particular. And when you put them on the lids, they often do use a lot of the sparkle, especially when you start blending and buffing them. So the best way to preserve the sparkle in these type of shades is to just pat them on. And the second you start blending, they usually lose their sparkle. So on one hand, these are nice because they can be used as a sparkle shade, but they can also just be used as a regular matte if you don't have a lot of deep mattes in here. And I will mention, this is the deepest somewhat matte shade we have in this palette. Okay, so that is No Sleep Club. You can see I definitely lost a lot of the shimmer. Like I said, this is a warm deep brown with some pink glitters in it, but you lose the glitters very, very quickly when you start blending. Finally, I'm going to go into Endless Party. And this is really pretty. This is like a smoky quartz kind of shade. Okay, so that is Endless Party. And that's also a very, very pretty shade. Definitely like a deeper kind of gunmetal shade. I do think that is very pretty as well. I do think these shades are all very pretty. They all performed really, really well for me. So let's take these off and create a very simple look, and then I will show you comparisons. All right, so let's create a quick look with this palette. I think I might start with Vibing on a really fluffy brush, and I might just kind of dust this one in the crease and all over the lid just to sort of set that concealer. I don't normally use concealer for my primer, but I don't really need my eyeshadow to last well today. Next, going into VIP Only. This is probably how a lot of my looks with this palette are going to start out, but I can also see myself just reaching into Space Cowboy Rides Again, just for all over the lid, all by itself. Although this really is a perfect crease shade. It just gives me just the right amount of definition. You are always going to get something pretty neutral out of this palette, but I do think the shades in here are very, very beautiful. The mattes are blending very easily. I do feel like these lighter mattes are definitely on the sheer side, but you can really build them up. Kind of typical of Urban Decay's usual formula. Okay, for the sake of trying to use a few shades, I'm going to dip into No Sleep Club, and I'm just going to pat this one on that outer corner, kind of framing the eye out a little bit better. And I'm not going too intense with this look by any means, because I do think this is a palette that is meant to give you those lighter, more ethereal kind of looks. They're just meant to give you some sparkle. But I do prefer a little bit of depth on the outer corner. So of course, I'm going to take Space Cowboy Rides again. All over the lid. I just think this shade is so pretty, and I love how it's got a little bit more of a silver fleck to it compared to the original. I do think it's messy, so I do think it's one where I'm going to end up blending the edges a lot, but I do think that is super pretty. That looks really, really pretty. I do really like that look. Very, very sparkly. I did get a ton of fallout, so that is something to keep in mind. I usually do with the Moondust shadows. They do say you're supposed to apply the Moondust shadows with a finger, and I definitely think that is the best method, but I still get a lot of fallout with them. So just something I like to mention, but I do think they're such a pretty formula. All right, so I do think that is really pretty. Let me pop off camera, pop on some mascara, and then I will come back to show you some comparisons and my final thoughts. All right, so here is the finished final look, and I think it came together really well. I do think it's very, very pretty. Definitely a look I would go for all the time, and I really, really do like Space Cowboy Rides again. I do, and I think I like it more than the original. So let me zoom you out and talk about some comparisons. In discussing this palette, I'll be honest with you, the only thing truly unique about this is the shape and the design of the palette. I love how they have designed these other shades around the middle shade. I do think that's pretty. I do think that's a nice touch, and I really do like the new Space Cowboy shade here in the middle. I think it's beautiful, and I do think these outer shades are very complementary, and I think that this whole palette plays very, very well together. But first I wanted to compare it to the quad that came out last year. So this one actually has the original Space Cowboy in it. So I will pop up the swatches of this one as well, and you can see the difference between the two Space Cowboy shades. You can see that the newer one is definitely less warm, definitely more sparkly, and while there's not a ton of overlap on the eyes, I really don't think they're gonna look that different. So I do think if you got last year's palette, you probably don't need the new one unless you really want Space Cowboy Rides again, because it is a beautiful, beautiful shade. The next palette I needed to compare this to was the Makeup by Mario Ethereal Eyes palette, and the reason I needed to compare the two is because the shimmers in the Ethereal Eyes palette remind me the very most of the Moondust shadows. They have more of a sheer base to them. They're just very wet looking and very thin formulas, but again, very wet, very impactful. And then on swatch, while I wasn't able to get full shade for shade dupes, I think I got really, really close. And in comparing the two, which one do I think is better? I'm not sure you can get Ethereal Eyes anymore, but if you have Ethereal Eyes, I don't think you need the new Urban Decay. The Mario has a lot more shades, and the formula overall is better, and you do get all of these extra mattes in here, and I do love the matte formula in this palette. This palette is absolutely fantastic, so I do think that if you have this, you don't need the new one. Again, not shade for shade dupes, but at the same time, if you have one, creating the looks on the eyes are going to look pretty similar. I also pulled out my Natasha Denona I Need a Nude because I feel like you could easily recreate some similar looks with this palette. On swatch, they really don't look the most similar. There are some similarities, but they're not the most identical. I also pulled out my ABH Sultry palette because I feel like there is definitely some similarities there. On swatch, once again, you can see that there wasn't shade for shade dupes, but there is some definite similarities. I, again, think if you have this one, you probably don't need this one. However, not quite as similar as the Makeup by Mario. But I will say, I also compared this to the Patrick Ta Major Dimension 1 palette, so his very first palette. And this is, of course, the most neutral palette you can find. And compared to the Space Cowboy palette, there is definite similarities there as well. And I will also say the Patrick Ta mattes are much better. You do have a lot more options. The shimmers are also more impactful. Now, I do believe that the purpose of the Moondust shimmers is not to be super thick and metallic. They are meant to be a very thin, very ethereal looking shade. They are meant to just make the lids look wet and sparkly. That is the intention. So they're not meant to be these intense metallics that we're getting in some of these other shades. They are meant to have a similar effect to the Natasha Denona Wet Effect or the Makeup by Mario Ethereal Eye Shimmers. So I would compare them more to those two formulas. Compared to the Natasha Denona, her Wet Effect, I actually think the Moondust and Space Cowboy especially, but the Moondust shadows do have quite a bit more sparkle and impact to them than I think her Wet Effect shadows do. So that's saying something. I do still think Ethereal Eyes has this one beat, and I do think it's a better value. Again, this is $49 US for 6 eyeshadow shades. So it's not the best value. That being said, it's not a bad quality palette. I do think it's really pretty. I think it's cute. The packaging is cute. I think the formulas are great as well. And I am really loving the new Space Cowboy shade. Do I think this palette is a need? No, I don't. I would get this perhaps over the new quad that they have because 2 of those shades are in here and there really isn't a huge price difference between the 2. So I would probably get this one over that if you're looking for something. But if you have the Ethereal Eyes from Makeup by Mario, I don't think you need this. Or if you even have Sultry or the Patrick Ta, I really just don't think you need this because you're going to be able to create some very similar looks, especially if you have the Makeup by Mario or even any of the Natasha Denona palettes that have that wet effect formula. I do think you're going to be able to create a very similar look. Would I recommend this? Yes and no. I think that if this is something you're really wanting and you don't have the other palettes that I mentioned that are quite similar, then sure. I don't think you'll be disappointed, but I would probably wait for a sale. Keep in mind this is limited edition, so this will be on sale in a couple months, but it is a really cute palette. The shades are really nice. I just think it's way too expensive for what it is. But I do think that if you are wanting this, then I would pick it up on a sale and I don't think you'd be disappointed. I do also think this would be a great gift, especially if you have a younger person in your life, like a teenager or something like that. I do think this would be a great gift. I really do. But overall, I don't think it's a need, especially if you already have a lot of makeup because you can probably very easily replicate a lot of these shades. And additionally, this star, it's going to be so cute to display, but it's going to be hard to store. So I think it's cute. I think if you can get it on sale, then you won't be disappointed, especially if you're really eyeing this one up. The new Space Cowboy shade is so beautiful. I really do love it, and I do think it's a great gift. But that is it for me today. Let me know all of your thoughts down below. I love hearing from you guys so much. If you're new here, I hope you'll consider subscribing before you go. I do upload at least 3 new videos every single week. Thank you again so very much for watching, and I will see you in my next one. Bye!